Welcome to our deep dive today. During the Cold War, it wasn't always about, bombs and missiles. Sometimes it was about maps and deduction.
Yeah.
Today, we're going back to 1957
Okay.
to unpack a declassified CIA document called Possible Guided Missile Testing Ranges in the USSR.
It's like a Cold War detective story. The U.S. intelligence community was trying to piece together where the Soviets might be testing their missiles, and they had to be creative. We didn't have satellites or drones back then.
So it was all about good old-fashioned analysis.
Exactly. This document reveals how they, systematically considered geography, logistics, even the weather
Wow.
to pinpoint potential launch sites and impact zones.
Oh, wow.
And what's fascinating is that they got pretty close to the truth.
Hold on, before we get to the answers, let's walk through the puzzle.
Sure.
What were some of the key factors the CIA was looking at?
Well, first off, distance.
Okay.
They wanted sites far enough from non-Soviet bloc borders, at least 500 miles, to minimize the risk of observation. But then there's the issue of space.
Yes.
Right? You need vast open areas for missile tests, ideally sparsely populated for safety reasons.
Right. Launching a missile isn't exactly a neighborhood-friendly activity.
No.
But wouldn't those remote areas also pose logistical challenges?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The report dives into this, highlighting the need for access to existing infrastructure.
Okay.
Rail lines, roads, airfield, even something as basic as freshwater sources for personnel, all factored into their assessments.
So it's not just about finding a needle in a haystack.
Right.
It's about finding a needle in a haystack that you can actually get to and work with.
Precisely. And let's not forget terrain.
Yeah.
The report specifically mentions the need for relatively flat areas, suitable for constructing the infrastructure. A missile testing range demands.
Okay.
Mountainous areas or dense forests. Not so ideal.
And of course, the USSR has a pretty diverse climate.
Yeah.
I imagine that played a role as well.
It did.
Yeah.
The report spends a considerable amount of time comparing the climates of different regions. The steppe and desert regions with their predictable weather patterns were considered much more favorable compared to areas with, harsh winters and heavy snowfall.
Okay, so we're starting to see how the CIA narrowed down the possibilities.
Right.
But did they identify any specific locations as likely candidates?
They did, and one of the first that jumps out is Kapustin Yar.
Oh, yeah.
Its location near the Volga River, the relatively flat terrain, the semi-desert climate. It ticked a lot of the boxes.
But it's also relatively close to populated areas, right?
Yeah.
Didn't we just say that was a concern?
We did, and the report acknowledges that.
Okay.
But Kapustin Yar also had a significant advantage. Existing infrastructure. The presence of a rail line passing through the town would make it much easier for the Soviets to transport materials and personnel.
So the trade-off was between risk and logistical ease.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what's amazing is that the Soviets actually were using Kapustin Yar as a rocket development and testing site at this time,
Wow.
though the U.S. didn't have definitive proof yet.
So even with limited information, the CIA's analysis was remarkably on target.
It really was.
Yeah.
But Kapustin Yar wasn't the only location they considered.
Oh.
The vastness of the USSR meant there were other intriguing possibilities, each with its own set of advantages and challenges.
For example.
Well, how about a site near the Aral Sea?
Okay.
A region so remote, the report actually states that the potential impact area was almost totally unpopulated.
Talk about isolation, but wouldn't the logistics be a nightmare in such a remote location?
They certainly presented challenges.
Right?
The report even acknowledges the distance from major supply centers.
Yeah.
However, it also points out a potential advantage. A main rail line connecting Moscow to Central Asia that passed right through the region.
So a bit of a trade-off again. Remote and isolated, but not entirely cut off.
Exactly.
Okay.
And if the Soviets were testing longer-range missiles, they'd need even more distance.
Right.
The report actually explores some even more remote areas for ICBM tests, pushing the boundaries of what was logistically feasible at the time.
I'm guessing those options were even more challenging.
Let's just say the CIA had its work cut out for it, trying to decipher the Soviet strategy across this vast landscape.
Well, now I'm hooked.
Yeah.
Where do we go next on this deep dive?
Let's venture deeper into the heart of Russia to a place called Kirov, and then even further north to the frigid expanse of the Kola Peninsula.
Wow.
Both fascinating locations, but fraught with unique challenges.
Kirov and the Kola Peninsula. Okay, we're talking dense forests, harsh winters, and a whole lot of remoteness.
Yeah.
What made the CIA even consider these areas for missile testing?
Well, Kirov first.
Okay.
Its location was intriguing, about 600 miles from the Finnish border.
Okay.
Remember that distance rule?
Yeah.
That put it right on the edge of that 500-mile buffer zone.
Well, so strategically it had potential.
Yeah,
But I bet the terrain wasn't exactly ideal for a missile base.
you'd be right.
Yeah.
The report paints a pretty vivid picture of Kirov.
Yeah.
Undulating hills, thick forests, rivers, and creeks.
Oh, wow.
Imagine trying to build a launch site, transport massive missiles, and set up the necessary infrastructure in that environment.
Let's just say I wouldn't want to be the construction crew on that project.
No.
And then there's the weather, right? Didn't you say Kirov has brutal winters?
Brutal is an understatement.
Oh, my God.
The report highlights the heavy snowfall, poor visibility, and just the overall harsh conditions that persist for a large part of the year.
Yeah.
Not exactly conducive to precise rocket science, is it?
So Kirov was a bit of a long shot.
Yeah.
What about the Kola Peninsula? That's even further north, right?
Yeah.
Practically in the Arctic Circle.
It is, and the CIA was particularly interested in it because of its proximity to Murmansk, a strategically important port city.
Okay.
There were reports suggesting missile activity in the area, so the CIA had to investigate.
But wouldn't launching missiles so close to an international border be incredibly risky? Think of the potential for an incident.
It's a great point. The report actually mentions that, highlighting the possibility of observation by British and Norwegian vessels given its location near the Barents Sea.
Right.
So the political stakes were definitely higher in that location.
Plus, I can only imagine the logistical challenges.
Oh, yeah.
The Kola Peninsula has to be even more unforgiving than Kirov in terms of climate and terrain.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The report describes rocky terrain, dense forests, and of course, that incredibly cold climate.
Yeah.
We're talking 7 months of snow cover.
Wow.
Try launching a delicate piece of technology in that environment.
It seems like both Kirov and the Kola Peninsula presented a whole bunch of hurdles.
Yeah.
Were there any locations that seemed more promising, maybe a bit more hospitable, let's say?
Well, how about we switch gears and head to the Carpathian Mountains?
Okay.
They offered a different kind of advantage altogether.
The Carpathians, mountains aren't exactly known for being flat and easy to build on.
Right.
What made them stand out?
It all boils down to one word.
Range.
Range. It's situated in the western USSR. The Carpathian Mountains allowed for the maximum possible range length for missile tests within Soviet territory.
So if they were testing ICBMs, the Carpathians would let them really stretch their legs, so to speak.
Exactly.
Okay.
And while the mountainous terrain definitely posed challenges, the report mentions existing road and rail facilities in the area, which could mitigate some of those logistical difficulties.
Plus, being further west, wouldn't that put them closer to potential targets in Europe?
Precisely. It's
Yeah.
all about strategy, right?
Right.
But remember, the CIA was playing a balancing act. The report also flagged the higher population density in the Carpathians compared to those desolate stretches near the Aral Sea or in Kirov.
So a trade-off between range and potential risk. It's like the CIA was weighing a complex set of variables for each location, trying to anticipate the Soviets' next move.
Yeah, it's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
They were piecing together a puzzle with limited information, but they were doing a remarkable job of getting into the minds of Soviet strategists.
Right.
And this wasn't just limited to those big areas we've talked about.
Okay.
The report has a fascinating section titled Other Possible Launch Areas, where they consider even more possibilities.
Oh, come on, you can't leave me hanging like that.
Uh-huh.
What other locations were they looking at, spill the beans?
Well, one that particularly piqued my interest was the Arbatskaya Strelka,
Okay.
a narrow strip of land in Crimea.
Crimea! Even back then, that must have been a sensitive area.
Oh, yeah.
Why were they interested in that spot?
Strategically, it was a bit of a wild card. But the report mentions that a railroad had recently been built on the east coast of Crimea.
Okay.
Remember, infrastructure is key.
Yeah.
That new rail line might have made the location more logistically feasible than it had been previously.
So the CIA was watching for any developments, any infrastructure improvements that could hint at potential missile activity.
Exactly.
What else did they uncover in this treasure trove of other possible launch areas?
There was another location that really surprised me. A site near Ust-Kut in eastern Siberia.
Wow, okay.
It's incredibly remote, but the report suggests that launching from there could significantly extend the range of an ICBM.
Hold on, are we talking about hitting targets in the U.S.?
They were exploring that possibility.
Wow.
The report even mentions launching an ICBM from Ust-Kut all the way to Attu Island,
Okay.
the westernmost point of the Aleutian Islands.
Wow.
It was a bold, almost audacious idea.
Talk about thinking outside the box, or in this case, outside the continent.
It really highlights the scale of the challenge the U.S. intelligence community faced. They were trying to stay one step ahead of the Soviets to anticipate any possible threat. And all they had were maps, reports, and their own analytical prowess.
It really does make you appreciate the work they were doing. It was
Yeah.
like a high-stakes game of chess with the fate of the world hanging in the balance.
Exactly. And while we now know that the Soviets ultimately focused their ICBM program on Kapustin Yar, the fact that the CIA considered such a diverse range of possibilities, from the dense forests of Kirov to the far reaches of Siberia, speaks volumes about the uncertainties and anxieties of that era.
So what does this all mean? What can we learn from this deep dive into Cold War intelligence?
It reminds us that geography played a pivotal role, not just in the placement of missiles,
Right.
but in shaping the entire strategic landscape of the Cold War.
Okay.
The distances involved, the terrain, the weather, even the curvature of the Earth, it all factored into the decisions made by both superpowers.
It's easy to forget that in our age of instant communication and satellite imagery, back then it was a constant battle against the fog of war,
Hmm.
a struggle to decipher the intentions and capabilities of your adversary.
And that struggle had very real consequences.
Hmm.
Miscalculations, misunderstandings, and the fear of the unknown could easily escalate tensions, pushing the world closer to the brink.
It makes you wonder, how did those limitations in intelligence gathering, that constant feeling of uncertainty, affect the decisions made by leaders on both sides?
That's a great question, and one that historians continue to debate. But perhaps this deep dive has given you a new perspective on the Cold War, a deeper appreciation for the complexities involved, and a renewed sense of just how high the stakes really were.
It wasn't just about finding the right spot to launch from, though, was it? What about where those missiles might land?
That's another key piece of this puzzle. The report actually refers to these as impact zones, and they were just as important as the launch sites themselves.
Okay, so walk me through this. How do they determine potential impact zones?
Well, it all comes down to range and trajectory. The CIA had to consider the types of missiles the Soviets might be testing. Shorter-range missiles would require impact zones within Soviet territory. But for those longer-range ICBMs, well, things get a bit more complicated.
I can imagine. We're talking about distances spanning continents. Did they have any specific locations in mind for those long-range tests?
They did. One that stands out is Kamchatka.
Kamchatka. That's way out in the far east of Russia, right? Across the Bering Sea from Alaska.
Exactly. And because of its location, it was a prime candidate for ICBM impact zones. The report actually highlights the remoteness of the region, stating that the population density was extremely low, which would minimize the risk to civilians.
So, kind of a tragic silver lining in a way. The isolation that made some of these regions challenging for testing also made them potential
It's
targets.
sobering thought, isn't it? But it underscores the strategic calculations that were happening during the Cold War. Both superpowers were trying to balance their testing needs with the risks involved, both to their own populations and to international relations.
Makes you realize the weight of those decisions, doesn't it? So we've covered launch sites, impact zones, geography, logistics, even the human element. What's the big takeaway here? Why should this Cold War detective story matter to us today?
Because it reminds us that even in an age of advanced technology, human judgment and analysis still matter. The CIA analysts who pored over these maps and reports, piecing together clues, trying to anticipate Soviet strategy, they were the unsung heroes of the Cold War.
And their work, as we've seen, was remarkably accurate.
It was. And it highlights the importance of critical thinking, of understanding the interplay of geography, technology, and strategy. These are lessons that remain relevant today as we navigate a world that's still grappling with the legacies of the Cold War and facing new challenges to global security.
This has been a fascinating deep dive. Thanks for taking us on this journey back to 1957 and for reminding us that history isn't just about dates and events. It's about the people who lived through those times, the decisions they made, and the lessons we can learn from their experiences.
It's been my pleasure. Always happy to delve into the archives and uncover those hidden stories that continue to shape our world today.